Hello, I'm Mark. I own The Complete Sculptor, and we have been doing this kind of digital class since last March, obviously for COVID reasons. And I wanted to just say thank you all for coming this evening and going over all this cool stuff that we're going to try and get at. So I'm going to start off with sort of an overview of what the mold making and casting process can do for you. I mean, basically the idea is that you're going to make a custom version of a negative mold that allows you to reproduce a material or a different material from an original, right? Most common everyday mold you can think of that you use pretty much every day. And I'm going to just, it doesn't have to be rhetorical, but the idea would be something like an ice cube tray, right? If you think about an ice cube tray, what an ice cube tray is a mold for water to become ice. So you take one material, make it into another material. The idea of mold making in the sculpture or architectural or culinary worlds or all of these things is about taking some sort of thing that you want to reproduce and make multiple copies of. Sometimes that can be in the same material. Other times it could be in a material that's completely different. So it allows you the opportunity to be a little bit more flexible about the kinds of things that you want to make. Now, a lot of people, when you're sculpting in some sort of medium. For sculpture purposes, typically it allows you to make a model or an original in one medium that may or may not be fragile or degradous, like clay or plastiline or wax, and then to model directly in those materials and then reproduce them in something else, like resin or cement or bronze or glass or tofu. I mean, you really have no limitations in terms of the types of materials that you can use to replicate your pieces. And that's what's truly interesting about the whole process. So as we think about mold making, there's literally a starting point and an ending point. And once you have those 2 points in concert, you can figure out how to get between them. And sometimes that's a straight line. It's a very simple one answer and it's ready to go. And other times it's going to be something a little bit more complicated where you may have multiple steps in order to achieve your goal. And I'll give you an example of that. You know, if you want to make a mold off of a plaster piece and you want to cast more plasters, you may be able to just make a silicone mold off of that and cast new things into it. If you want to go to bronze casting or glass casting, those two in particular do require a multiple step process because you have to create a mold off of the original, but those rubber molds will not be capable of withstanding the temperatures of molten metal or molten glass. So then you have to make a wax. Then you would make what's called a refractory mold in order to do your bronze casting or glass casting. So it's the same idea, the same premise, but to understand where you need to go in the process is pretty important. So the first step is knowing what your original is, right? So if you're going to make a mold off of it, you have to understand what that is, whether it's wood, clay, stone, wax, chocolate, a person, right? Obviously, if it's a person, you want to be careful with things. We have particular materials for that. But the idea is that understanding what your starting point is, which is your original material, is super important. Secondarily on that is going to be the characteristics of it. Which include volume. Is it, small? Is it big? Is it intricate? Is there a lot of surface detail? Is it have very tight tolerances in terms of a geometric shape? Does it have things that are called windows, right? So when you have a window in a piece, there. So this piece right here, it's a little bit more complicated, but this kind of a mold has what we call windows, which are pass-throughs. So if you were to pour a solid piece over it, you'd have to either cut it to get it out, or you could make a two-part mold to take it apart. So the form of the piece is very important. In addition to that, the shape as it's cast, because now with a piece like this, when you make a mold off of it, and then you flip it upside down because that's the way you're going to pour, right? So now we're pouring into the mold from here. You want to make sure that the piece will flow with the material into all of the sections, that no places are going to trap air, things like that. So the shape and the form, as well as the size, really contribute to the type of model that you're going to, and the type of mold that you're going to make onto that model. The next series of questions you're going to ask about that is, do I need to do anything to that surface in order to make the mold? Do I need to seal it? So some things are wet, like wet plaster, wet clay. Some things are contain chemicals that can be inhibitory, like a sulfur-based clay. So the first question you always want to know is, do I need to seal it? The second question is, do I need to release it? Right? So now you're going to have your original, a sealant, release. The answer may be no to any of those questions, but I want you to start to think about the process and understanding the questions to ask. A lot of people come out of this class going, oh my God, now I know why I pay a mold maker so much, and I don't even want to do it. And other people come out of it and say, okay, this makes sense. And now you can start to design your pieces in a way, not to curtail your creativity, but to understand that when something is more complicated to produce, it ends up being more expensive. So, you know, you start to be able to gauge these things and make better determinations about your pieces and about the process for the molds. So also incorporated into that first series of discussions is, what do you want to cast it in, right? Because again, starting point is your original, ending point is what you want to cast. That's your reproduced pieces. And the spot that goes in between helps you choose that mold material. So the size, the shape, the material, the raw material, and then what you want to get to as a finished product. Because a lot of the finished products can only be cast into certain types of mold compounds. So that said, once you've got these 2 points, you can figure out what best fits in the middle, which will include the molding compound itself, again, the sealant and the release, and also the mode that you make the mold. So whether it's a brush-on mold or a pour mold. So all of these factors come into play when you're trying to choose the appropriate material. It's about the process, it's about the products, right? So all of those things go into determining how you're going to decide what process to use and which materials to use. So then as you're starting to look at materials themselves, there's going to be something called a data sheet, okay, which sounds, you know, impressive, but it's basically a form that's going to give you a list of numbers that you're going to have a little bit of difficulty understanding in the beginning, but basically it's the information about the physical properties of the products. So on that sheet, one of the first things is something called hardness or durometer or shore. All right, those are all synonymous for a scale of flexibility. That scale, typically in the mold making world, runs from 0 to 100. 0 being super flexible and very soft, and 100 being still bendable, but what we call a semi-rigid or less flexible material. Now, why is this important? If you're trying to remove a piece that you have to bend the mold considerably in order to take it off, then you want something a lot more flexible. If you have something that's got incredibly tight tolerances and you don't want to use a support structure afterwards, then something less flexible, more rigid, is going to be better. Now you can make actual rigid molds, but just to give you a scale, so this mold right here is a 90. Okay, so this is a 90A on the Shore scale. Now you can see that the material is not very flexible, all right? But when you put it down, what happens is that it holds its shape perfectly. So you can fill this mold with material and it won't distort. Whereas if you have a softer material, what'll happen is in this thickness, the walls will bend more and you'll get more distortion in your piece. And that would be something like this, right? Which is, so this one is a 20. You can see, you can twist it in half, right? Now, one of the other things that's related to flexibility is thickness. So if you take a more rigid material and you make the mold wall thinner, it's still going to be more flexible. If you have something that's softer and you make it thicker, it becomes a little bit firmer. It's just the physics of it. That all makes sense, right? And I'll show you that sort of an example, because you don't necessarily need to use silicone just for molding compounds. You can use it as a finished product also. But just to give you an example, so this is a 10, right? Now you'll notice that the flexibility here is significantly greater than the flexibility here. It's still compressible. They are the same hardness. It's just that the thickness of the material makes it less bendable. Right, the nose is very bendable. So that's a 10. This one is actually a below 0. Yeah. Always fun to play with. And then I showed you a 20. This one right here, and you can see this, and again, this kind of flexibility, this is a 30. So as the material gets to be harder, it holds edges better. As it's softer, it pulls out of undercuts more easily. And you can even have a mold. So this one is a very thin mold, but this mold you can literally turn inside out. And this is a 25, right? But because it's so flexible and so thin, you can literally peel it off. So that's a 1-part, easy to use mold. On every tech sheet, and typically on products, the actual flexibility of the product is in the name. So rebound 25, 7345. The last digits are the Shore hardness of the material. So at a glance, when you're looking at many of these materials, you can tell the hardness right away. And that's an easy thing to pick up as you see different manufacturers. The second thing on the list is going to be viscosity. And viscosity is measured in something called centipoids, or CPS. And 1 centipoid is water. Honey is about 80,000 centipoids. And peanut butter is 1 million. Turn it upside down, doesn't come out of the container. Now, why would you need something thinner or thicker? Right? I mean, why wouldn't they all just be the same? The reason you would want it thinner, let's say you want it to pour into things and you want it to capture all the surface detail. The lower viscosity something is, the less likely there are to capture any bubbles, because the bubbles come out because the viscosity is lower. If it's thicker, you can use it as a brush on. It doesn't drip as much. So if you're having to work on something vertical, if it's a putty, you can work over your head. You can press it into a thing and it doesn't come off. So the viscosity of the material will help you understand how it's going to behave when you go to use it to make your mold.
Oh, this is Julie. You let us know like when to choose like a low viscosity over a high viscosity?
Well, I mean, it's just based on how you need the material to behave. Right. So if you're filling a box mold, if you're pouring a mold, then you want it to be lower viscosity because it's more likely to fill all the crevices, not trap any air, and be a better pour. If you're doing a brush on, you would like it a little bit higher. If you're doing, a putty mold, it's going to be like it's almost like clay. So it's just about the choice that you make of the material in combination with the method that you're making the mold.
I have a question, Anna.
Yeah.
Does the viscosity have anything to do with the dry time?
Not necessarily, no. So all of the features of the physical properties of the materials are typically independent. The only two that are really locked together would be working time and curing time. So typically something that cures faster has a shorter working time, right? Because it has to generate that whole finish. So your actual time from that you mix it together and then start working will be shorter also. But viscosity, color, hardness, any of those things come in a variety of different working times.
When would you use the putty one?
Well, I mean, if you're working over your head, there's also there's a number of people that just love the putty because it's super easy and there's no mess, right? Because there's no waste, because you're mixing up batches and pressing it on as you go. It's difficult to make a mold off of something soft with that, so people don't usually use it over clay, but it's great for doing, stonework or metal or architectural pieces, things like that. It also works outside really easily, and it's environmentally friendly. So those are the typical applications.
Marcus Antonella, what does it mean, brush off on? Well, I don't know what it.
Well, that's a brush.
Oh, okay.
Right?
So you
Brush
can
on.
actually brush the silicone?
Yeah.
Oh, never heard. Okay, great.
Awesome. See, you got your money's worth already. Yes, I will show you a bunch of different types of molds as well as we go along. But it's literally, most of the names for these things are pretty intuitive. So pour mold is literally you're mixing the material and pouring it in. Brush on mold is where you're brushing on the mold, and a putty mold is when you're pressing it on.
Okay.
Okay. Next thing is mix ratio. Now, mix ratio is super important. Now, the units are almost irrelevant, but materials are either mixed by weight or by volume. If they are mixed by weight, you must have a scale. Okay, it means that you have to weigh them. Now, the two components that you're putting together, or multiple components, don't have the same specific gravity. So unless it specifies that by weight or by volume is the same, you can't do that. So it's very important that you that you have a scale if it's mixed by weight. The units can be grams, they can be pounds, they can be ounces, they can be feather weights, they can be penny weights. Doesn't matter as long as the ratio is the same, right? So if it's 1-to-1 or 10-to-1, 15-to-1, whatever it is, you have to have a scale. If it's by volume, again, same thing applies. So the units are irrelevant. I don't care if it's in milliliters or in ounces or in pints, gallons. I mean, you could be mixing multiple 55-gallon drums. But as long as it's measured in the appropriate mix ratio, it's very important to pay attention to those. One of the biggest problems with mold making materials, especially the multi-component ones, is an improper mixing. And if that happens, unfortunately, the material will not cure properly. And that really is the biggest user error that exists. So I want you to just make sure that you read that paperwork and understand that if it says 1-to-1 by volume, that's great. Now, the by volume measurement materials typically have a little bit more play because they're expecting you to eyeball it. So even though you're going to use a container that has, graduations on it, right? This one's in liters, this one's in ounces. So if you're eyeballing this on two next to each other on a table, there's always a little bit of room for the margin of error to exist, right? So you're eyeballing, you're either at the line, a tiny little bit under the line. So 1-to-1 materials by volume are usually pretty forgiving to a point, but you always try to be as exact as possible. So again, by volume, you need a container that has a mixed, has either graduations or even those red solo cups, because they have lines in them. So you can see those, but anything that's graduated works really well for that. Okay, and again, doesn't matter what the units are. Now, the one caveat to this is that most of the materials are pre-packaged in units that basically work. In other words, if you have a gallon of something, you buy a gallon kit, and it has a 10-to-1 mix ratio, and you don't have a scale, but you're going to use the whole thing, you can take that catalyst and pour it right into the thing and mix, because the kits are made to work as they are. So that's the one way to escape having to measure, is if you're using the entire kit. That make sense?
Yes, and when you measure on the scale, you generally detract the cup that you're using as a container, which always messes me up.
Well, okay, so on every scale, if you're working with a digital scale, they're really easy that way, because there's something called a tare button, T-A-R-E. Okay, and what that does is you put the empty container onto the scale, you push the tare button, and it brings the scale to 0 with the container on it. So you have a scale, and you take your container and you put it on. We're gonna pretend I have a scale, right? So you put that on the scale. Then there's a button on the scale that says TARE, and what that means is 0 with whatever's on it. Okay, so you can push that button with the bucket on there, and now we'll say 0. So you start to add your material. Okay, now you can even use that tare button again for the second material, right? So let's say you put in is everybody comfortable with grams? It's just easier because it's metric.
Yes.
Okay, so let's say you put 100 grams of part A in here, right? And you watch it, you fill it up, it gets to 100. Now, 10 to 1 is pretty easy. You know you have to get to 110 with the other one, right? But let's say you want to just do it anyway. So you could hit the tare again, and now it's going to go to 0, even with that 100 grams in there. And now you can put your 10 grams in and watch it go up. So the tare button is designed to 0 the scale with whatever's on it.
Saying you need to re-tare your scale when you're done so that it goes back to 0.
Correct. If you tare it with the bucket on it, and then you take it off, it'll be, depending on the size of the bucket, it'll be at negative, 6 grams or whatever the weight of the bucket was, will be what it reads when you take it off.
Are there
So you want to make sure that you're using identical containers or tearing each time.
when you just mentioned being able to pour into the same one, but are there other times where you actually have to mix in the separate containers to like release air bubbles before? I feel like I've read this somewhere.
Well, it depends on the material. So the lower the viscosity, the less necessary things like that are, but you have the capacity to now that everybody knows about a tare button, you can tear all day long. You can, some people prefer to measure their materials out in 2 separate containers because it hasn't started their working time. So they'll pre-measure things out, leave them on the table till they're ready, but then it's ready to go. Other people, they're just, in it. A lot of this is sort of like cooking. So what happens is we're talking about raw materials and everybody's got their own process. And some people are very methodical and neat and clean. And other people, you come in and there's a tornado in there. There's rubber on the walls and, which is less useful in COVID. But I guess if you're bouncing off the walls, it's good to have them covered in rubber. So the idea is that understanding the tools and again utilizing them in a way that facilitates these molds being as easy as possible. I mean, that's really what you want, right? You want this to be an easy and this should be, instead of being the irritating, scary part of the process, this could be fun too. You come up with ways to sort of make it part of your creative process.
Do you throw out the buckets afterwards, or can you just clean them?
Depends on the material that's in them.
Say it's the silicone.
So for silicone, yeah, I mean, if it's catalyzed, what'll happen is it'll cure and then you can peel it out. Sometimes it comes out with stuff in it. That's a brush, right? So and your brushes, always use inexpensive brushes because they become spatulas afterwards, right? If you're doing a brush on mold. But the idea is that, yes, I mean, you want to try to recycle as much as you can for reuse. And that, again, this whole process should not be as daunting. And from this class, what I really want you to take, I mean, obviously you're going to take notes, you're going to try and write everything down that I say. Part of my job ongoing is to help you choose a material under any given circumstances, right? So the purpose of the class is really so that I can help you figure out what questions to ask or know what questions I'm going to ask you when we're trying to choose a material. All right? I have 62,000 items in the store. I don't expect you to remember them all or understand how they all work. And if you do, I will offer you a job. But that said, so the purpose of the class is really to understand sort of how all of these things come together and just frame your ability to understand the process, right? And then hopefully not too far in the future, we actually run hands-on mold making classes where you come in with a piece and you make a mold in presence. So the next thing in your list is toxicity. Now, and I know nobody wants to talk about toxicity, but it's measured in skull and crossbones.
Mark,
Right?
before you move on,
Huh?
Julie
Yeah.
just wants to know when you would not reuse the bucket.
Well, I mean, eventually, well, first of all, you want to reuse buckets and mark what was in it. In other words, let's say you had a bucket and even though you cleaned it and it had silicone in it, you don't want to necessarily use that for polyurethane, and certainly not the other way around. So you start to accumulate buckets that you're using for certain types of things, and eventually they get, something gets stuck to it, it gets too dirty. I mean, I don't know how else to be clear about it. We try to recycle as much as we can, and then, then eventually I throw them away. I mean, of course, I want you to throw them away so you buy more from me, but other than that, try to reuse them. But silicone is pretty non-caustic and comes out of pretty much everything. So.
Are you always throwing away those cheap brushes, or is it possible to salvage them?
The chip brushes are typically, well, again, I actually, I have made a number of tools out of them after they have silicone on them. So sometimes I'll go back in and I can use that silicone brush that's now coated in silicone, and I'll cut it up, and then I can use that for applying casting materials. So that's the recycle mode, because now it's coated in silicone, nothing sticks to silicone, so it's great as long as you're not working with silicone. But you have to get a little bit of ingenuity involved in order to recycle the things like the mixing sticks and stuff like that. But you can use them multiple times. Toxicity. Toxicity is a very sensitive topic. Basically, a lot of the materials we have, there are, in my opinion, two types of toxicity. There's intrinsic and then extrinsic, right? So there are some materials that are inherently toxic. The chemicals that are in them, the sensitivities that can exist. And then I have a multiplier for toxicity, which is stupidity. And that means that you have the capacity to take any material, toxic, non-toxic, and hurt yourself with it, right? They say you can drown in a spoonful of water. Well, all of these materials are basically like power tools, right? So you have a circular saw, and some of you may have used a circular saw, but if you have a circular saw, you don't leave it unattended, plugged in and running, right? So a little bit of common sense goes a long way. And then in addition to that, because a lot of these things are chemicals, one thing you really need to be conscious of is yourself, right? So as much as we have materials that are non-toxic, some people have allergies, some people have sensitivities to things, and you need to really pay attention to yourself and how you're working. And if you come into contact with a material and it makes you not feel good, pay attention to that. Maybe don't use that material anymore. So short of the actual things that are in a material that can kill you, like, isocyanates or things of that nature, you have to actually just have a little bit of common sense when using stuff. Questions about toxicity?
I generally use acetone to clean brushes or.
So there are solvents for every given material. When you're working with, first of all, acetone itself is a solvent that you don't want to be breathing, right? I mean, a little bit here and there takes off nail polish. It's not good for your lungs. So without a flow of air or some sort of respiratory protection, acetone is not ideal to have open and working with it. Chip brushes are very inexpensive. I mean, at some point, it's almost not worth it to try and clean them from silicone. It just, also the acetone leaves a residue that's on the brush. So now if you go to put that into fresh silicone, sometimes you can leave a residue of acetone in there, which softens the silicone and distorts it a little bit. It's probably trace amounts, but I try to use virgin materials, especially with silicone, because it's a pretty sensitive material and it's expensive as a raw material. So when you try to get penny wise, pound foolish, sometimes that's where it gets to be an issue. I mean, obviously you want to recycle and reuse as much as possible, not just for money, but for the earth, right? But you try to be as conscious of that and make good choices. The idea is to obviously, again, do that as to the best of your ability. But again, acetone itself is not a great thing to be breathing. Certainly not drinking. Okay. So while we're on the topic of price in terms of reusing and recycling, I bring up price of the raw materials. Mold making is not an inexpensive process. Okay. Even waste molds, which are just plaster, can get to be inexpensive, to have around, to have the buckets, to have all of these things. So, but one of the things I want you to do is when you look at the price of a material, try not to, again, make choices that are short-sighted. Sometimes a more expensive single material can decrease the price of your overall project or job. So before you decide whether to go with something more or less expensive, look at the project, right? Because that's really what's going to come together. Because now, we've got questions. I started a cycle for you. What's the original? Do I need to seal it? Do I need to release it? What's the material? How do I get it to my end product? So some of those steps may be that you don't need those things, which is an additional product, additional price, that are like unseen prices. So sometimes a more expensive product can be more effective for the job. So I just want you to try and keep that in your mindset. There's not, in our business, in my business, there's not a lot of upselling. I don't know if all of you know what that is, but it means selling somebody something that's more expensive that does the same job. There's not a lot of that in the industry because so many different products exist and they are very specific to projects and contextual, right? So every time you go into one of these things, you're going to say, okay, can I use this, 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 and this? Do I need something slower? Do I need something faster? Do I need something shorter? Do I need something for volume casting? Do I need something blue? I don't, whatever the color is. So the and features of all of these materials change from product to product to product. And then, so there's typically a most appropriate product, regardless of what that pricing structure is. In addition to that, one of the things about price is time, right? So some things that take longer or are more laborious can be less expensive. But what you're compromising with is that you're putting your time into it. And then it just depends on what your time is worth. And we try not to judge. So that's up to you guys. Okay, so questions about materials themselves. I mean, the features. Yeah.
My name's Christy. Is there certain silicones is there certain silicones that tear easier when you're doing the release? So
tear strength is absolutely a feature of all materials. And there are going to be some that have a lower tear strength and some that have a higher tear strength.
Is that on the data sheet?
It is. Okay. And it's typically measured in a pounds per square inch feature, which really doesn't yield any true information to you. But what you want is basically shear strength, right? So as we go through the materials, for instance, silicones, generally speaking, as a group of materials, tear more easily than polyurethanes. Polyurethanes have a very knotty tear strength. Then there are economy silicones and there are high performance silicones. High performance silicones typically have a greater tear strength than economy silicones. Okay. By the same token, something softer has more elasticity, which doesn't necessarily increase tear strength, but because it has more elasticity, it reads as tear strength, if that makes sense, because you can stretch it out more. It's not that it won't tear under the same stress per square inch. It's that the flexibility of the material is such that you can get a longer section of that. So it's not registered the same way, but it is a feature.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So when we talk about materials, there are a couple of things that I'm going to touch on very quickly, and I'm just going to buzz through them because majority of the work you're going to do are probably not going to be with these materials. But there's a product called polysulfide, also known as black Tuffy. Black Tuffy is a sulfur-based rubber that was primarily used in the foundry industry. It was very popular because it works over wet water-based clay. So you could literally put it over a wet water-based clay. You didn't have to wait for it to dry. It would make the mold. In addition to that, it was pretty much foolproof. It always set up. So, you know, as they used to say, the guys in the foundry room couldn't. I don't know what I'm allowed to say on this Zoom. It's recording, but they couldn't screw it up. So the product was also sulfur based, and it contained lead in the catalyst. Now, all that good stuff aside, it was a foolproof rubber. It was basically designed for the plumbing industry because it would set up against water. So it was used actually as an original material for packing pipes because it would stop leaks. They started using it as a mold in the 1900s, and then it became a very popular product in foundries because people were using Roma, which was a sulfurated clay, water-based clay, and these materials worked perfectly for that. Disadvantages to it is that you cannot cast resin into it because the material contains sulfur, so resins don't work in it. So it started to fade away as a common material because it really had not very little usage in terms of, you know, the people that were doing DIYers or doing mass casting in plastics. So it was really good for wax and plaster, but not good for any other materials.
Mark, before you move on to the next material, I just had a question in regards to tearing. Is there ways that you can repair tears?
So each material does have an associated adhesive that is designed to repair molds, right? So for urethane molds, there's a product called Urabond, which I'm sure Morgan will put up in your thing. For silicone molds, there's something called Silpoxy or SAM32. If you have longer time to wait, you could also use just a straight, clear caulking will act as a mold repair material for silicone-based products. So the next material we're going to talk about is the only single component material that we sell for mold making, which is latex. And latex is old school. It's made from natural rubber. It's still compounded. It actually comes from rubber trees. What they do is they take that sap and they compound it with solids. And the higher level of solids that are in the latex make it a firmer or stronger latex. All latex molds are done as a brush-on mold because the material needs to dry or dehydrate, right? Because it's single component. You open it up, you can use it, you close it up, stays. It's like a can of paint though, so if you leave it open, it'll skin over the top. So you always want to make sure you're sealing up your product as you're working with it. The nice thing about latex is that it is single component, but as you're making a mold, you have to brush on a layer, wait for it to dry, brush on a layer, wait for it to dry, brush on a layer, wait for it to dry, brush on a layer, wait for it to dry, repeat, 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 and sooner or later you have a mold that's about that thick. So the process is much more laborious in terms of your own time frame and brushing on layer after layer after layer. These materials are good for polyester casting. They're good for plaster casting. They're good for cement. Wax is not a great material for casting into latex molds because the heat starts to break down the latex very quickly. And therefore, a lot of the resins also do that similarly. You cannot cast silicone as a finished product into a latex mold. The material comes in different versions. So there are thinner ones and thicker ones. It used to be really, really inexpensive, but now everything is pretty much unilateral in terms of the pricing. So latex still is about $80 or between $75 and $85 a gallon. The cleanup for latex is ammonia. So that's your toxicity portion of this. It actually smells like Newark on a hot summer day, for all of those who know New Jersey. But it's got that fishy kind of an ammonia smell. Typically for cleanup on your brushes, you've got a cup of ammonia there open, and you're putting your brushes into that in order to clean them because it degrades the latex while it's still in liquid form. The typical release for latex versus any other material is going to be something called PVA, which is polyvinyl alcohol. And that is available in a brush-on or a spray bottle. And you would put that on, let it dry before you make your latex mold. question about latex? Latex can also be used as a casting material, which is one of the other advantages. Both foam latex, a lot of puppeteering, the Muppets are a big user of foam latex, and they still do actually, but a lot more into silicone now. The next section of materials that that we really want to address is going to be the ones that one of the first categories that you're going to use. So polyurethanes, which was that hardness, but they do come significantly softer. But this is a polyurethane mold. Polyurethane molds have some of the best tear strengths. They're one of the first one-to-one mixed materials. So these were materials that were heavily used as mold materials by people that were working in their own shops, because all of a sudden you didn't need a scale. So 90% of them are mixed 1-to-1 by volume or 2-to-1 by volume, depending on the material. So these molds are very simple to work with. They are hydrophobic. They do not like moisture, which means working off of wet water-based clay, wet clay. If it's raining outside, we don't pour polyurethane molds because it can create a soft cure, which means the material, when it comes into contact with moisture, actually acts as a foaming agent and it'll stay kind of soft. The polyurethanes contain something called isocyanates. Isocyanates sound a lot like cyanide because they're a lot like cyanide. However, the off-gassing of these products, it's heavier than air, so it'll actually come up off of your molds, drop to the ground. So it's really only super dangerous if you have pets or kids that you want to keep around. The best protection against that is both a respirator, but a flow of air, right? So if you have an open window, then you're circulating air, that's going to keep that from building up. Like everything else, toxicity exists as what they call a ppm, or parts per million, which is an exposure. So the less exposure you have to something, the less toxic it is for you. They are allergens, however, so you can develop a sensitivity to polyurethanes even after using them safely for years. They are incredibly durable. You can cast pretty much anything into them. No foodstuffs, they're not food grade, but cement, plasters, any of the gypsums, the reinforced cements, resin, and certain ones have the ability to cast silicone into them. The thing about polyurethanes is that they always require a release. They are natural adhesives. So if you're making a mold off of something, you do have to make sure that you're releasing that surface prior to putting a polyurethane mold on top of it. Regardless of whether it's poured or brushed on, it has to be released. The polyurethanes come in a variety of viscosities pre-made. So they have products that are called brush-on products. There's brush-on 50, 40, 60. Again, the numbers at the end are the flexibility of the material. There's also something called Polygel 35. That's a brush-on polyurethane. And all of these products are 1-to-1 by volume, super easy to use. And a lot of architectural people are using them because the polyurethanes are still less expensive than the silicones. So as the mold making materials go, the polyurethanes are actually the least expensive in the list. Questions about polyurethanes?
Can you use wax?
Can you use wax into polyurethane? Yes.
Thank you.
You mean for casting? Yeah.
Yes.
You can also use wax as a mold, but it's a one-shot deal. And then, let's see.
Just release agents per different types of polyurethane that would work better with like in terms of like the different viscosities and stuff, the 50, the 25, all that.
Well, so those are the hardnesses.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
That's okay. So again, you're basing it on what your original is, what you want to reproduce, right? So if you need something that has more flexibility, you go with a lower number. If you want something that's a little bit more rigid, you go with a higher number. All right, and that's your range. And typically for the polyurethanes, the brush-on range is from 35 to 60.
Got it. And
So
the agent would be the same for any of those.
I'm sorry, the what?
The release agent.
Correct. So all polyurethanes are you're going to use a silicone-based release for polyurethanes. So there's a product called 2300, Universal Mold Release, 2910. Anything that says it's got silicone in it is good for polyurethane. So when you're doing a release, basically it needs to be a resist, right? So you don't want two things that are the same. You want two things that are different, so they come apart.
Got it.
Okay. Then we get into silicones. So silicones are going to be the most common for everything that you're going to use these days. 3 reasons. Number one, they're non-toxic, generally speaking. I mean, you still can't drink them, but basically, and as a general rule, don't drink anything we sell. But no silicone cocktails. But the other than that, they're non-toxic, right? So they don't irritate your skin. They're not caustic. I have yet to meet anybody who's allergic to it, but that doesn't mean it can't happen. I'm not a doctor. I just play one on TV. And the idea is that all of those things compiled with the fact that they're now super easy to use and many of them are 1-to-1 by volume has made them very, very popular. There are 2 different types of silicones that we're going to talk about. The first one is called tin-based or condensation cure silicone, and that one is the first of the silicones. It does give off alcohol as a byproduct, not the kind you want to drink, but it's an off-gassing of that after the fact. It's not harmful. It's just something to take into consideration because it's on the surface of the mold if you're doing casting into it. Most of these materials are mixed 10-to-1 by weight for the tin-based, at least the good ones. There is a 1-to-1 by volume tin-based silicone. It's called UMU 25. And as we were talking about it before, the tear strength on that is terrible. It's an economy-based silicone. It's designed for doing low runs of things and also not a lot of deep undercuts or anything like that because it's a little bit brittle. So the tear strength on UMU 25 is not that good. But it's about $160 for 2 gallons. So it's the least expensive of the silicones. Again, that one mixed 1-to-1 by volume makes it very easy to use and to work with. The nice thing about tin-based silicones is that they pretty much set up against any surface. So you're less worried about sealing a surface or working with it that way. There is a release that you can use for it. And again, super, super important when using any silicones, you must make sure that the release does not contain silicone. If you put a silicone spray onto a piece and then pour liquid silicone, it's going to adhere like glue. Because the only thing that silicones stick to is themselves, right? So you want to use a silicone-free or non-silicone-based release. The Man 200 is a good one. The Poly's 2500. Price Driscoll makes a Petrolese 33. And on our website, I actually have a section that says releases for silicone. So you'll be able to chime right in there. Anything in there. Vaseline works. The only disadvantage to using Vaseline is that it's very thick. So when you apply Vaseline to a surface, sometimes you leave a texture. And that texture is going to be reproduced in the mold materials.
How about baby oil, Antonella?
I don't like baby oil because it seeps into any oils seep into the silicone and can create a tacky surface. It's okay. The other thing about baby oil is that almost all of them have fragrances in them, and some of those chemicals that create those fragrances can sometimes inhibit the molds. It's less important for tin-based silicones, but for platinums, it can create problems.
So do you always need a release for the tin?
Not always, and some people just like to be safe. You know, better safe than sorry kind of thing. If you don't have enough information about your original, then sometimes it's better to put a release if you don't have enough info. But for many things, it does not require a release.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So the other advantage to it is that, again, you can cast pretty much anything into a tin-based silicone mold. It has a lot of resiliency. Now, some of the clear resins that you may want to cast will come out foggy if the mold is new. If the mold is older, or you can cook the mold, what's called a heated post-cure, and that will remove the alcohol from the surface, which allows the castings to come out, shiny and clearer. So there's all little bits and and changes that go into based on the materials you want to use. So the next group of materials is platinum-based silicones, and these are probably the ones you're coming into contact with all the time. They're based off of dental or medical grade silicones that are now used for everyday applications. So they're a lot less expensive than dental silicones, but they have the same kinds of characteristics and durability and lack of toxicity, which is great. So they're also the ones that we use for body casting. So if you ever do body casting, you would use a platinum-based silicone, and there are a couple of different brands that do that. So the platinum-based silicones come in either a by weight or a by volume measurement. A lot of the people that are doing simple molds, brush-ons and pours, are using one-to-ones by now. Almost all of the companies have one-to-one mixes, just because it makes it so much easier to use. So the product line out there is extensive. It ranges from from below zero, right, for doing prosthetics and things like that, all the way up until typically the hardest silicone you're ever going to use is a 60. Above 60, they start to get brittle and will become almost like an eraser. And if you ever touched a pencil eraser, you can rub it off and it sort of breaks apart. And that's what happens to very rigid silicone. So most of your mold making range is going to be from 10 to 60. There are also, for the platinum and both tin-based silicones, there are a couple of silicones that are even higher temperature resistant for doing low temperature metals like pewter and tin. So the P50 and the Mold Max 60 are great for doing low temp metals. And those are both silicones. And again, the higher the durometer, the more durable the rubber, right, in terms of rigidity. So for high temperature materials, it acts as a heat sink, so the material has to be a little bit firmer because it's getting cooked in the process. So the one downside to platinum-based silicones is that they are very sensitive materials, right? So you can say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, and the material doesn't set up. What's interesting is that there are a lot of different products that can interfere with the casting of platinum molds. So I once did a mold with somebody and they said to me, this material sucks. It's got all these weird things on it. It's not cured. So I go over there to see the mold, and there are all of these little circles of uncured rubber that are on it. And we went back into it, and I'm looking at it, and then I realized that they come in clusters of 5. Turns out they were using latex gloves, and wherever they touched the platinum-based silicone with the latex gloves, it didn't set up.